Good morning, Dan and Amy. We're coming to you live this morning from Integrated Physical Medicine in Roselle, part of our AM 560 Signature Bank Business Tour this spring. And this is an interesting topic to me, and we've discussed it on this show before, criminal justice reform. Remember we had Michael Javon Fortner on from CUNY, Amy?
Yeah.
There's an interesting perspective, academic perspective. He went back and looked at the increase in the stringency of drug laws in New York City under Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who was kind of a squishy Republican governor. And so to the argument that's often made by the left about drug laws meant to keep minority families down and this and that, and minorities being treated differently. There's some argument about the minorities being treated differently depending on the nature of drug crime. But the research that Fortner provided indicated that the call for more draconian drug laws was from minority families living in neighborhoods that were beset by gangs and drug crimes. Most of these quote-unquote bad neighborhoods are neighborhoods that have a high incidence of violent crime. Most of the residents are law-abiding. Most of the residents want police presence. Most of the residents want criminals to go to jail because they want to live in a safe place just like anybody else. And that's certainly the case in Chicago. So the question is what to do about criminal justice reform such that you provide a way back for people that are nonviolent offenders, or even somebody perhaps that was a violent offender as a youth and has demonstrated that they've turned their lives around and can be a productive member of society, and upholding the rule of law and putting predators away so they cannot repeatedly terrorize residents of a particular neighborhood, a particular city. We've had a lot of discussion and a lot of calls from Tiny Dancer and Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson, a lot of criticism of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office in terms of this turnstile justice where you have gangbangers, even criminals who've committed crimes with guns, be turned back onto the streets.
Right.
These incidents where somebody's arrested for a murder who's been arrested for 17 violent crimes previous to this murder. So how do you strike this balance? Well, there's a new book on the topic from a law professor at Fordham University called Locked In, The True Causes of Mass Incarceration and How to Achieve Real Reform. And it offers some information, data-driven information that suggests that a lot of the kind of widely held beliefs about what is at the root of our relatively high level of incarceration compared to other Western countries may not be what people think it is. And for more on this, we're pleased to be joined by the aforesaid Fordham University law professor John Pfaff. Again, the book Locked In, The True Causes of Mass Incarceration and How to Achieve Real Reform. Professor, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
So what did you find from your research and then putting together this book that would be jarring to people who think one thing in terms of why people are in prison, and it turns out that there are other factors that are not given the kind of attention they deserve?
I think there are three big things that people think matter more than they do. And the first is locking people up for nonviolent drug offenses. It turns out that while we tend to think most people are in prison for these nonviolent crimes, about 53% of all people in state prison have been convicted of a crime of violence, and only about 16% have been convicted of a drug offense. So if we're interested in changing the scope of incarceration in a substantial way, we have to start thinking differently about how we should punish people who've been convicted of violent crimes. The second big factor I think people overstate is how long people are in prison for. I once asked a room full of undergrads, how long do you think someone convicted of a violent crime spends in prison? And they were saying 20, 30, 40 years. The median time is only about 4 years for a crime of violence. It's about 1 year for a crime of property or a drug crime. Our prison population is driven much more by people sort of entering for short stays rather than sort of these very, very long sentences. And the third factor I try to argue is that for all the talk about private prisons and people profiting off incarceration, the real political actors who drive this are oftentimes the public sector, the politicians who benefit from having prisons in their counties, the correctional officer unions who are looking to preserve the wages. We talk about how private prisons make $400 million a year in profit, but guards make $25 billion a year in wages, and so they're a much more powerful political force.
Well, why do you think some people are violent in the first place?
I think it's careful to realize that violence isn't necessarily a phase. Some people are more violent than others, but people also tend to follow very clear patterns of aging into and equally importantly, aging out of violence. An 18-year-old is more violent than a 12-year-old, but a 40-year-old is consistently less violent than the 30-year-old or a 20-year-old. And California just experienced this when they released about 2,000 people who have been sentenced to very long third strike sentences, and they released them early. And their recidivism rate is 1/10 the level of the state average. So where the state average recidivism rate is 50%, these early releasees have a recidivism rate of about 5%. And a big part of it is they're just older. They're in their 40s and their 50s, and they're just less likely to be violent. And I think oftentimes our laws ignore the fact that, yes, younger people age into violence, but they also tend to age out. And we need to be aware that we tend to throw the key away oftentimes when people are just about to start aging out of crime.
I want to just refer you to a rather jarring statement that came from Chicago police last year. They essentially said, look, given the incidence of violent crime in the city, as you're well aware of,
right?
So look, there's about 1,500 people in the city we know are likely to either commit a murder or be a victim of a murder. And this is the population that is responsible for a preponderance, if not a majority, of the violent crime. How do you react to that statement from the research that you've done?
I think so. My focus is primarily on the world prison, and I think the important lesson to take away is that even if that's true, that there's identifiable groups that pose a serious risk of either causing or being victims of murder, using prison to prevent it is oftentimes a very inefficient way to accomplish that goal. Long prison sentences provide almost no deterrent impact whatsoever. There's no evidence that threatening someone with a longer prison sentence is more likely to cause them to stop offending than a shorter sentence, or it's much more the risk of being caught in the first place that matters. And so I think, yes, Chicago has a serious murder problem right now that needs to be addressed, but I think there are much more effective ways of addressing it with interventions that target sort of the causes of gun violence at their root, rather than trying to rely on sort of this distant threat of incarceration down the line.
Well, so the clearance rate for homicides, for example, or other violent crimes, is that important? Because, I mean, the clearance rate in Chicago has historically, for the last decade, been about 25%. Last year, it was under 20%. But that turns out to matter?
I think that matters significantly, that focusing much more on clearance rates would be a much more effective approach than trying to focus on putting severe sanctions on those few people you happen to pick up. And I think an even more telling clearance rate problem is I believe Chicago's clearance rate for non-lethal shootings is below 10%. It's like 5 or 6% of all shootings that don't result in death result in arrest. I think they need to focus much more on improving the clearance rate than on trying to sort of severely punish those who they do happen to pick up to make up for their inability to capture people in the first place.
John, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you know what the prison rate is here in the United States?
So the overall incarceration rate for just prisons is something on the order of about 500 per 100,000. If you add in prisons and jails, it's around 650 per 100,000. And there's no other country in the world that has an incarceration rate that high, with the exception of the Seychelles, that has a population of 99,000 people and a prison population of like 500. But other than that, we have the highest rate in the world. The only countries close to us are places like Russia and Kazakhstan and Cuba. European countries, it's oftentimes 1/10 what the rate we have in this country. And I think to me, the more telling statistic that makes me think that this can't be an efficient way to approach things is that our crime rate today is about where it was in 1970. But our prison population, incarceration rate is 5 times greater than it was back then. So unless we're somehow so much more violent today than we were in 1970, that doesn't make much sense. If anything, I think the current young people, the millennials and the cohort behind them, are actually much less violent than the boomers were in the 70s, which suggests to me that from a public safety point of view, we're just not getting much for the scale of incarceration that we're relying on.
But I want to go back to something you said earlier when you asked those undergrads that you teach or that you spoke with about what they thought the average prison sentence was, and they were off by a factor of 5. It's
right.
20 years, it's 4 years. Eddie Johnson, the police superintendent in Chicago, and others are suggesting, well, part of the problem, as I said at the outset, is that you have violent criminals that are returned to the streets after relatively short sentences, and you're talking about how you age out of crime. I mean, is it something where if you're a 20-year-old who commits a crime with a gun or commits a violent crime, an attempted murder, rape, Class X felony, that you need to be incarcerated for a long time until you kind of age out of that behavior. We just need to keep predators off our streets for longer periods of time. Doesn't your research suggest that would help?
In theory, I think that's right. I think what makes it tricky is that we're actually very bad at predicting when someone is young, if they're going to keep offending or not. So if we simply adopt the policy that, well, young people are violent, let's lock young people up longer, we're going to really incarcerate people because we're very bad at figuring out who do we really need to focus our attention on. I think that's why non-prison approaches that try to sort of target the underlying causes of violence and disrupt it before it happens are more effective because they don't require you necessarily to figure out what is sort of the lifetime risk of this person offending, and we tend to be very, very bad at that. The other problem, I think, with locking young people up is that one of the reasons why people age out of crime, some of it's hormonal, some of it's biological, some of it's just, I'm 41. I'm just not going to get in a fight now because I know I would lose. I'm just older and things changed before.
I'm pulling for you, man.
But another part of it is that things like having a job and getting married pull you out of the environment where you're likely to engage in bad behavior. And the longer you're in prison, when you're young, the harder to get a job, the harder to get married, and so these other pathways out of sort of violent behavior get closed off. So it's a very tricky problem that I think consistently pushes towards trying to disrupt it from the intervention outside of prison point of view than sort of reacting with incarceration as the response.
I can see the point on root causes and talking about the family and some of the other issues that you mentioned. But in the short term, in terms of what do you do to provide security for people now, given the landscape, the reality on the ground as it exists, in addition to police focusing more on clearance rates, are there other short-term reforms or readjustments in thinking that could be made to improve safety in the streets?
I think this is a program that's tried out throughout the country. Its success rate is mixed, but it seemed to have been very successful in Chicago, was this program called Cure Violence. And the rise in shootings in Chicago seems to be tied very tightly to the exact moment when Springfield cut funding for Cure Violence in Chicago. And what Cure Violence does, the attitude is the fact that it views gun violence as a virus, that when A shoots B, B's friends shoot back at A, and they hit C, and so you can watch the shooting sort of spread through a social network. One study found that something like 400 shootings in Chicago could all get tied back to sort of one initial shooting, and then sort of there's this spread of retaliatory shots that spread. And so what Cure Violence tries to do is actually tries to interrupt that transmission, that when A shoots B, they try to sit down with B and B's friends and family and neighbors and try to figure out a way to make sure that it doesn't spread. And at least in Chicago, it seemed to have been very successful. And sort of the uptick in shootings and violence in Chicago seems to be tied, not perfectly, but there's a strong connection between the cut in funding for that and the rise in violence. And tellingly, I think, really interesting is the one neighborhood that didn't see its funding get cut is the one neighborhood that's resisted sort of the upward trend in violence that the other neighborhoods like it have seen. So I think there are not just sort of official police responses, but other kinds of social interventions that try to really target the violence, not like the root causes of poor education and things like that would take decades to fix, but really can work on trying to address the immediate causes of violence in a way that doesn't necessarily rely on prison.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay. John Pfaff, he is a professor of law at Fordham University. The book, Locked In, The True Causes of Mass Incarceration and How to Achieve Real Reform. Professor Pfaff, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.